Okay, so in this video I'm going to try and tackle what is quite a difficult subject, and because there's no real official research or body of study that relates to this subject, there are no real terms to talk about certain aspects of the subject. So for me to feel as though I'm making sense or we're kind of on the same page, I feel as though I need to define or clarify certain terms. So the intention isn't for this to be patronizing in any way, but more literally just so I feel as though what I'm saying will make sense to people and I will be generally understood when I talk about certain things. So the first term is simulacra, which means something that has the likeness of something else. So basically just something that looks like something else. Simulacra. The next term is natural simulacra. So simulacra could be man-made, intentionally to look like something else, or you can also get natural simulacra, something that just naturally looks has come to look or have the appearance of something else. So for instance, an example might be a particular notch in the side of a tree that from a particular angle looks like the side profile of a face. You might describe that as an example of natural simulacra. And the next term is the dreaded P word, pareidolia. So quite often when people see an example of a natural simulacra, something that just naturally has the likeness of, let's say, a face, they quite often call that thing pareidolia. They just say that's pareidolia. But pareidolia isn't, you wouldn't refer to an object as pareidolia. Pareidolia is a cognitive response that somebody has to a stimulus, an unintentional stimulus. They just happen to think that thing looks like a face, but you wouldn't call an object pareidolia. The object is, and it would, you would call it simulacra, an example of simulacra. So it's perhaps just important to draw that distinction. And another way of considering pareidolia is as a type of visual illusion. The region in the brain, I think the occipital cortex, the region that is kind of stimulated by pareidolia experience, is the same kind of region that's stimulated by visual illusions. So pareidolia is really just a type of visual illusion, but that just occurs naturally. It's a naturally occurring visual illusion. And so the last term is really one that I've coined myself, I suppose, taken from using the ancient Greek as the kind of standard that already exists. Taking firstly the word techne, which in ancient Greek means art or craft, and the word lith, from the ancient Greek word lithos, which basically just means stone. Like we've all heard of a megalith or a microlith, meaning a big stone or a little stone. So techne and technelith would basically just mean art stone. So I refer to the objects as a technelith, an art stone. There are other terms to refer to at least the art style: portable rock art, position sensitive art. These are examples of terms that relate to the art style, which I have another term that I've coined for that, paramorphic art, but I'm not going to talk about that too much because I don't want to confuse things too much. But that refers to the art style, but not necessarily the object. And there are terms like figure stone, referring to figure stones. The problem with that term for me is that it gives the impression that the stone, in every case, in its complete form, kind of in the round, creates a figure. But sometimes the art stones don't create a figure at all. It might the stone in its kind of complete form may have a pretty much natural appearance, or what at first seems to be natural to the untrained eye appears to be natural, and then a particular section on the stone under close analysis at the right angle might reveal imagery. So imagery that is intentional art. So for me, the term figure stone doesn't really seem to cover what the object actually is. So I call it an art stone or a technelith. And so the subject of this video is identifying the difference between or understanding and identifying the difference between natural simulacra that causes a pareidolia experience and a technelith, an art stone that has been intentionally created by somebody to induce the same kind of visual illusion, perhaps even imitating or borrowing, even sometimes incorporating some of those natural cues and triggers that cause or that exist on a natural simulacra that will induce a pareidolia experience. Some of those cues and triggers that are imitated or borrowed and incorporated into a work of art, a technelith, that induces the same kind of experience, that same kind of visual illusion or illusory stimulus. So recognizing the difference between natural simulacra and a technelith, an art stone. And so now the introduction is out the way, I'm going to kick it off by showing a clip from a recent trip that I had up to a Neolithic flint mine. I made a video on that and I posted that on YouTube, and some people might have seen that. Whilst I was there, I checked out a part of the hill that is an open quarry with exposed sections of chalk and seams of flint. So let's just take a look at that now. So I just pulled this straight from the seam, and if we apply some of the same kind of approach, you can start to see the potential for a face. You can definitely see why so many people disbelieve the portable rock art or regard so much of it as just natural pareidolia, because of how easy it is to just pull a piece of flint out of the seam like this and find imagery. So is this it? Is this the end of the debate? We can pull a stone unquestionably natural in its form. It's pulled from the seam in which it was laid down as sediment 65 million years ago or thereabouts. And any imagery, any facial imagery that can be, or otherwise any imagery that can be discerned on the piece is unquestionably naturally occurring. It is a natural simulacra. Any experience of a face can be described as a pareidolia experience. There's no question in it. So is that the end of the debate? For many people in the academic world, it is. They stop at that point. They say pareidolia exists, these forms of natural simulacra exist, so any type of imagery that can appear hidden within or upon a stone is therefore just pareidolia. The experience is just pareidolia. It's just an example of natural simulacra, and therefore we can just dismiss this object as natural simulacra and unimportant, and we can regard the study of it as unimportant. There is no grey area between natural simulacra and figurative sculpture. There is no grey area. Well, is that it? Is that the end of the debate? And of course, I myself and many other people say no, that's not the end of the debate. There is a huge grey area between natural simulacra and figurative sculpture, and that is the area of perhaps modified simulacra. The recognition or the ability to recognize that there is a big difference between this natural simulacra and this, a technelith. So what are those differences? What is the thing that is creating this discernible, noticeable difference between these two objects. If we take the proportions of the human head, the distance from the eye to the bottom of the chin line, is roughly the same distance as from the eye to the top of the head. So if we apply this to an example of a stone from my collection that I regard a technelith, we can see that the distance between the eye and the jaw is roughly the same distance as from the eye to the top of the head. Obviously the technelith is wearing a hat, but we can see the curvature of the tapering of the hat, which indicates the curvature of the headline, and we can see that these appear to be accurate proportions. The line takes us to a point that exactly intersects this point where the rim of the hat seems to taper in, indicating the, as I say, the top of the head. If we apply the same process to another technelith from my collection, we get the exact same thing. The distance between the eye and the chin, that same line takes us to a point on the top of the head that exactly intersects this point where we have the tapering in towards the headwear, indicating the top of the head. But if we apply that same process to our natural simulacra, you can see the line quite literally takes you off the page, off the photograph, meaning the proportions are completely inaccurate. So perhaps herein lies an important insight. Pareidolia will, or the tendency to experience pareidolia will allow you to see a face. You will experience a face, but nature doesn't have to worry about representing proportions accurately. People perhaps tend to more. Perhaps the human tendency to represent the head accurately, our hand-to-eye coordination, perhaps it's just innate that we will inevitably do that more accurately. So what is this thing, this magic ingredient that creates this difference between a natural simulacra and a technelith, an art stone? Well, it's really quite simple. The difference is composition. And this is exactly why, if the criteria, the recognized criteria that's used in lithic analysis to recognize forms and methods of lithic reduction, if those criteria are only ever those that are applied to chains of operation in tool production that lead to the production of tools, we're never going to move beyond the spot that we're in. We will never explore that grey area, and it's a difficult subject, because although art, the paramorphic art or the position sensitive art, however you want to term it does exist on tools, and it is created by forms of flaking, and those reduction techniques, the common reduction techniques that lead to tool production. But this is the point. Flaking isn't the only technique of lithic reduction, and it's almost as though all techniques are only there to support flaking. All other techniques are just kind of these ancillary sideline techniques that are there to support the ultimate aim, which is to flake the piece, to create a tool, something more often than not that's aerodynamic. But there are other techniques that can be used that do not necessarily leave the same kind of identifiable marks, mark making. There are techniques that involve chipping, cracking, heat treatment and cracking, chiseling, rubbing, heavy abrasion, rubbing of cortex. There are a multitude of other techniques that are employed in the creation of a technelith. If you're only ever looking for those chains of operation that apply to tool production, how are you ever going to identify the production methods that are used to make this other item that's completely different, that isn't a tool? So this is what I'm trying to communicate, is that whilst although the lithic artwork can be found on tools, and tools that show signs of chains of operation that would be acknowledged by academia, the chains of operation would be acknowledged, the imagery would be refuted, it would be regarded as unintentional. The napper hadn't intended to create that imagery, it just happened as an unintended byproduct of the napping process, and the experience is again pareidolia. However, so this is the point. Whilst the imagery, in my belief, does exist on tools, not all forms of technelith by any means. The vast majority are not tools. They don't appear to have, or at least they're not common tools, and they don't fit into the common designation of tools, and they don't have the same kind of utilitarian functions as cutting an object, blunt impacts, etc. They, in many cases, the primary function or purpose of the piece just seems to be as a work of art. So how do we move beyond this? How do we, what is the next step? What is the solution to this apparent conundrum or paradox? Well, I would suggest it goes back to that thing of composition, is to be able to recognize the potential for composition within natural simulacra, to try and understand ways in which simulacra could be modified to create techneliths. So if we return back, for instance, to our example of natural simulacra, one thing that if I had to approach this to create a technelith, first thing I would identify the most appropriate starting point, and I would actually, the face that I was focusing on previously, the reason I focused on that face is because that was the first face that I noticed. It was the first one that had a real impact on me when I pulled it initially out from the seam. That was the first face that I saw. It was the most striking and obvious face to me initially. But there's actually another area for a potential face within this stone, and that's on this section here on the lower left. More noticeable if we focus in on it a little bit, but still, if we analyze it and apply the same kind of process as we did previously, we look at the proportions, we can see the line still takes us above the intersection point where it would taper in towards the headwear, indicating the top of the head. So the proportions are still out, nowhere near the proportions are much better, much more convincing in comparison to the other face, where the proportions are off by a much greater margin. But although the proportions are better, they're still not totally accurate. So again, what's the solution to that problem? You would obviously just take some material off from the area that would be the chin. So you're moving the chin line higher up towards the eye to fix this problem of the proportions, and by doing that you would also gain some kind of neck definition. And looking at this, there's other areas that you could definitely target, in particular under the nose, to make the nose more pronounced, and maybe some work around the lips to make the lips more defined, and also perhaps around near the forehead to make the forehead kind of slope a bit more, like indicating the top of the sort of slope of the forehead up to the top of the head and the headwear. So the moment you start to do this, this object would cease to be a natural simulacra, and it would become a modified simulacra, and it would begin the journey on the vast spectrum of techneliths that exist, from very slightly modified simulacra up to very modified simulacra, up to tools that contain artwork on them. But even once the modifications that I just described had been made to this stone, this natural simulacra, to modify it to become a modified simulacra, a technelith, it would still be a huge difference between that result and what we see on the screen now. An example of a found technelith that was created, in my opinion, by an ancient artist, and that difference is obviously the contours of the face, as in the eye socket is quite literally a depression in the face, in the skull. The nose is a significant protrusion. There is a hole for a nostril. The lips are two distinct regions. A hat is literally sits on the head, and there is a noticeable variation in the thickness between the hat and the skin of the head. So all in all, the technelith that we see on the screen now has those features. We can see the cavity for the eye, we can see the nose protruding, we can see the nostril, we can see the two independent lips, we can see that the hat is sitting on the head. We can clearly identify the composition, and in the composition that this is a man wearing a hat. Again, for this technelith, we have an actual cavity for the eye. We can see the distinction between the nose and the top lip. We can see the two distinct lips. We can see the chin, the jawline. We can see that this is a man with a beard, long hair, and that's wearing a skull cap. We can see that in the composition of the work. So am I just going around looking at rocks, looking at stones, making deductions? No, I'm not. I'm not just taking what people tell me either. I'm doing the only kind of natural thing that comes to me, and I'm experimenting directly with this subject. And I have experimented with creating my own modified simulacra or my own techneliths, and this is an example on the screen now. It is a calcined piece of flint. It had been subjected to heat treatment. It was already like that when I found it, but it was undoubtedly heat treated. And I knocked this section out from a nodule. I placed the features on the left edge that we can see here. I created the definition for those features, just mostly using another piece of flint as a kind of chisel, and then another hammerstone to hit the chisel. That was to create the features for the face. Also some removal on the top section to create the kind of indication of the back of an animal, possibly a bird sitting on the person's head. Also some work along the jawline to create the kind of angle of the jawline that meets the hair, the bottom of the hair. And if we look at this piece, the proportions are much more in keeping with the processes that we looked at previously. So this is just an example of what a modified simulacra can look like, that is unquestionably man-made, and although it is admittedly a far cry from the examples that I've shown that are originals, that are the real thing, created by an ancient artist, it's still an example of man-made simulacra, a technelith, an art stone, that I feel is worth showing along with this debate, to show that these items can be made, that they can be composed, and they can still have an appearance that many people would still, on first engagement with it, probably just assume is just natural, just the product of natural processes. But that isn't at all the case with the stone that you're looking at on the screen now. It was 100% created by somebody with the intention for it to have this kind of hidden face along the left edge, or this face that might not be as apparent at first, especially if you're not used to looking for this kind of imagery on stones. You might just see a natural stone. I suppose that's the question that I derive from this. What I'm trying to say is, if you were to look at the stone on the screen now, and if you know, in being honest and true to yourself, that you probably would just assume that it's naturally occurring, and that if you did recognize any kind of imagery on there, you would assume it was probably just naturally occurring. And so a pareidolia experience, if that is the case, that you feel that way, then you should be prepared to explore the fact that then, where you look at other stones and make that assumption, if this piece on the screen now is unquestionably man-made, is it possible that some of those others that you look at and assume are natural, and the imagery is only naturally occurring, a pareidolia experience, some of those could also possibly be man-made? Surely, if I can make one that is man-made but also can be assessed as natural, or having occurred naturally or even unintentionally, well, then that same possibility applies to other stones that people find and present as examples of what they believe are ancient man-made artworks. Techneliths, portable rock art, position sensitive art, figure stones, whatever designation we want to call them, paramorphic art, it's all the same thing that we're trying to identify, which is that there is a huge grey area that exists between natural simulacra, lithic reduction, and figurative sculpture and fine art. And until people accept that there is this huge grey area, and people actually start to explore and experiment within that grey area, then we just sit at this impasse, this checkmate, stale, stagnant position in terms of recognizing lithic art. And here's the point: if we do begin to recognize that lithic art exists, it's a window into the lives of people in the ancient past. It's their equivalent of, in some cases, putting thoughts down, doodling, perhaps the news, passing on information. It's a record of their lives and their feelings and emotions, because that's what art is. And in certain areas of the Stone Age, in certain regions in particular, there is a distinct lack of real tangible expressions of daily life and the sentiments and the kind of core emotional being of people in the Stone Age. It's kind of a blank area. And yet, if we begin to acknowledge the existence of techneliths, we get another access into the mind and the social, cultural life of the people that created the artwork. So, of course, there is a huge benefit to be made if these items are genuine and do exist. Then surely they are invaluable in what they could contribute to our understanding of Stone Age life, the people that created them.